Thank you for having me. I love everything that you're doing. This is a very powerful, powerful show.
It's great to be on the podcast, so I'm rooting for you.
We are so excited to be here, and I'm so glad you have started this podcast. There's such a need to communicate this to patients.
Thank you for doing this show. This is the type of show everybody should listen to.
I've been listening to your podcast, and really a congratulations to you on launching your podcast and being able to have these conversations.
What you're doing with Genetics for Healthcare is empowering patients and caregivers, making them aware of something that they need to ask for, because not all clinicians are either going to be aware of this because it's not standard practice.
If I can impact one person, it makes me so happy to have spent this time with you.
Championing a show like this and featuring patients like us, not only is it imperative, but it is appreciated, because oftentimes in the sickle cell space, we don't always feel supported by industry, because sometimes it feels far removed, but you are doing the heavy task of kind of bridging both industry and patients and really serving the patient community. And so for the work that you're doing, I just want to say thank you so much for seeing us. It's one thing to recognize that we exist, it's another thing to truly see us.
This is Genetics for Healthcare, a podcast for patients.
Welcome to Genetics for Healthcare, a podcast dedicated to patients and their caregivers to help them advocate for a precision medicine approach to their healthcare, which includes disease screening, prevention, treatment, and surveillance for long-term life and quality of life. You can go to geneticsforhealthcare.com. While you're there, subscribe. You can find all of our episodes, but also become a subscriber, because you can get the transcripts to all the episodes that we have, any of the episodes that you want. And also we'll group this information by topic. Some is cancer, some heart disease, some prevention, exercise. We've got so much more content coming for you, and I'm really excited. And I just want to thank you as a listener, because you have the option to give your time and attention to anything you want. And we really are humbled and grateful that you decided to listen to these conversations on Genetics for Healthcare. If you didn't listen to episode 21, it's a great sampler about the patient stories that we share, those firsthand experiences with battling a chronic genetic disease like cancer or sickle cell disease. And this week, we're going to hear from the medical experts and scientists that we've had on the show to help us understand why genetic and genomic information should be relevant to us, why we should know about this, and why we should have the language and the confidence to have these conversations with your care team and your family members or whoever you care about. Before we get started, we're going to have some look backs. We're going to be announcing the clips. And please go back and revisit these episodes. If you go to the website, geneticsforhealthcare.com, you can go to any of our social media platforms where you can find reels and clips about these things. But to just respond to some of the questions, because I do respond. We get inbound messages. We get DMs on our social media platforms. Yes, I am in my office. I'm in my home office. I live in Dallas, Texas. And if you're watching this on YouTube, I have an even wider view of my office. It's usually really tight because, my background, I don't want you to be distracted. But there is a beautiful, it's not a portrait, it's not a poster, it is a painting. It is a very sturdy work of art by artist Jay Taylor and his Muhammad Ali series. It is unbelievable. And you can't see, for those of you who are listening on Spotify and our podcast can't see anything. But if you're looking at this, there is an inscription there that I'll read for you at the end. But very powerful stuff that we're going to share with you today. Also, people ask about our intro, the voice on the intro. It is my daughter, Zoe, who's 14 years old as of today. And she's just amazing. She's an artist. She does voices. She is for hire. She does voices as a narrator or voiceover talent. And she's a tremendous talent. And I hired her to do this. I also have a daughter, Marlo, my oldest daughter, who today is 16. You will hear her because we do have some upcoming sponsorships, and you will hear her in the outtakes and the commercial breaks as well. Our mission here is simply to increase access to precision medicine, to increase the knowledge, the awareness, the confidence, and our vocabulary to have these conversations because it is making a difference. What is precision medicine? Plain and simple, precision medicine is an approach to our healthcare that uses your individual genetic, environmental, and lifestyle factors to tailor medical treatments and interventions. Genetics is a core part of that. So, in this episode, we're going to learn the basics of genetics and genomics. What is it? What does it tell us today? And then, what's the potential? What's possible with this information that can help us eliminate chronic disease, cure, battle, or more effectively treat chronic diseases, which 5 years ago, 10 years ago, had no effective therapies or cures, but now we're seeing these lifelong diseases find cures. And it's only the beginning for rare disease, chronic disease through genetic and genomic insights. So we're going to be focused on increasing access to precision medicine through this platform. There are tests that are out there. There are so many tests that are out there that are different use cases, different ways to access these tests. Some of them you need a clinician to order them for you. Some can only be ordered by a certain type of doctor. Some of them are retail where you can go to the website and order this for yourself. But in any case, during the pandemic, the demand for genetic testing increased because of the atmosphere that we were in. COVID, 23andMe exploded. You heard, commercials all over the place. Hey, you get your 23andMe for someone for Christmas. And is it a great test? Can you do anything with it? Is this good or bad information? We've got some experts that are coming up. They're going to share more of that with you. What do you do with genetic information, no matter what the test is? Is it risk? Is it early detection of disease? Can you optimize your medication? Does your DNA have signatures or variants that make you more or least likely to respond to treatment? This is a very important topic, and we're going to get into it in this episode. It can mean the difference between life or death. It can mean the difference between you spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in unnecessary therapy, excessive toxicity, both chemical toxicity, which can just ruin your quality of life, if not kill you, and financial toxicity. So we want to arm you with information to be an advocate for yourself and for those you care about. Of course, AI is everywhere today, and we had several conversations around AI with experts in the field, and we've got some clips coming up there. And something I was actually really excited about was the role of social media to educate and empower the general public about genetics and genomics. We've got that coming up because this is what I do. Dr. Alan Wu talked about TikTok and how he used TikTok to reach more people. And of course, the hallmark of our show are the 3 practical questions that I ask every guest to share with our listeners to help them have more confidence in talking about genetic and genomic information with their doctors and incorporate this information into your healthcare ecosystem, your MyChart, because not only can it benefit you, it can benefit your children's children in a way that is far beyond what we can imagine. So I think a great place to start is with Dr. Chadi Nabom. Dr. Chadi came to talk to us in episode 12. He is a medical oncologist by training. He's a biotech executive. He's the host of Healthcare Unfiltered podcast, fantastic podcast. Be sure to follow that. And not to mention, he's an author. He wrote a book called The Cancer Journey, Understanding Diagnosis, Treatment, Recovery, and Prevention. He's a reminder for me that clinicians have big, ginormous hearts. They want to do the best they possibly can for their patients and the families that they treat. And so he wrote this book to share stories about these families and these patients that had profound impacts on him, because stories are the most powerful way that we can learn things, to help them learn about genetics, learn about these different aspects of cancer care, and again, advocate for themselves. So let's take a look and a listen to what Chadi had to say to us.
Look, both of us and every single person who is listening to this show is going to be a patient. They're either current patients, future patients, or past patients. No one, no one is going to escape being affected by some form of a problem. It may not be cancer, it could be heart disease, lung disease, whatever it is. And I'm not trying to put a pessimistic thing, I'm just being very realist. That's the reality.
Yes.
So, cancer, however, from all the diseases, like you just mentioned earlier, is a bit different because number one, the minute you hear that C word, you really feel almost as if your entire ground is shaking. Your entire life now is trembling, and it doesn't just affect you. You start thinking, where did I get this? Kids affected, family affected. How? I mean, every single thing. It has an impact on the patient and the loved ones more than any other disease. And I'm not downplaying the other diseases out there. I mean, heart attacks and strokes and other things are bad. Of course, they're bad. But there is something about cancer that shakes people differently. And you asked about what inspired writing the book. If you think we have a lot of information out there, we live in an era where we are literally drowning in information. You can go to any search engine and ask any question, and you get articles and blogs and websites and all of this. So we're not short of on information. But here's the interesting part and what inspired the book. Despite the information that we have, I continuously felt that patients and families are still confused about basic facts.
Mm.
The information are there, but they are confused about basic facts. Now, why is that? Because the more you have information about things, you could actually have um, signal and noise, and you cannot separate them. Anybody could put anything out there. So it becomes actually very difficult for folks to understand all the information that is out there. So there's so much signal and noise, and we need to separate them. So I thought to myself, why not write a book that is very easy to understand for everyone? And the best way to write something that reaches more people is by telling stories, being a storyteller and sharing stories, and by using plain and simple language. We react as humans to stories much better than lecturing and preaching and textbooking. Because if I tell you a story, I mean, I just told you a story about why I went into cancer care, about the woman I met in 1995, October 1995. I promise you, you're going to remember that story because I just shared a story with you about human interaction and we relate to that. But if I had given you like a big lecture about the importance of science and cancer care, what I got into it, you will forget that in about 2, 3 days, maybe less. So I wanted to bring the art of storytelling with plain and simple language, combine both, and come up with something that everybody can read. And these are all true stories. Every story in the book was a true story of a patient or a family member or a neighbor or a friend that I have taken care of. So whenever you read it, you're going to imagine yourself a character in the story and you can really relate to it. Through these stories, I bring the scientific points and the information. So if I talk about staging cancer, I tell you several stories that I actually went through and that shaped how I started thinking about simplifying the staging for cancer and so on. And lastly, I wanted to use the continuous journey of what happens from diagnosis until hopefully cure. So I put myself in the patient's shoes and I went step by step what happens usually, and hopefully this will become a simple guide for anyone who wants to read it. It doesn't have to be patients. This could be family member, a nurse, a student, a pharmacist, a doctor. Anyone who is interested in understanding the cancer journey in a very simple way will see something that will draw them into the book.
Dr. Robert Green, the director of the Genomes to People program for the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, and professor of genetics at Harvard Medical School, talked to us on episode 14 to help us learn the terminology and the potential use cases for genetic and genomic information. And in this episode, I thought it was really, really neat that he was there from the very beginning. He explains how in the early days, because he's very much a pioneer in the use and development of genetic information to treat patients and cure patients, he explained how the people were afraid. They were overly cautious, unnecessarily overly cautious about who should have this information, even though the information obviously belongs to the patient. They didn't want to give that information to the patient. They were folks in the field were really afraid about what this would do. So he shares with us how along the way, genetics and genomic information helped open minds to people who were once overly cautious and fearful about the harm that can be done. And then he helps us wrap our mind in a very basic way around the genome, the practical knowledge and daily usage of this information and what it can do to help us in our healthcare. Let's take a listen.
You mentioned the early studies. What was kind of the reticence or the hesitation at the time? Was there a prevailing belief that people didn't want this information? There would be some kind of angst of knowing it?
There was, and there still is. The issues around disclosing genetic information have not actually changed since the 1990s. They have shifted. So I remember before I trained in genetics, I remember approaching a geneticist and asking, hey, why don't we give ApoE back to people who asked for it? And he said, absolutely not,
Really?
completely
Wow.
unethical. You should never do that. And I think the concern was that there was a basic public misunderstanding of genetics and that it was highly deterministic in all situations, which of course it is not. That people would hear a risk factor like an ApoE4 variant, and they would assume that they were going to definitely get Alzheimer's disease. They would have catastrophic distress, suicidal ideology. So there was that whole idea. There was a sense that if there wasn't a absolutely direct treatment available, that we in the medical profession should not be talking about these risk factors. That's changed a lot, both because we have more respect for patients who desire information now, and because there are more treatments available now. And then there was a sense that's still true today that there weren't enough geneticists, there's not enough genetic counselors, and primary care docs and others wouldn't know what to do with this information. That's still kind of true today.
Explain to us, what is whole genome sequencing and how is it being used today?
Sure. So, as many of your listeners may realize, the DNA is a large molecule that is made up of chemical letters. There's 3 billion of those letters. About 2% of that genome, that DNA molecule, are the protein coding genes. And there is sometimes the body changes one of those letters, what we used to call a mutation, we now call a variant. And if the body changes the wrong letter, or drops it, or deletes it, or duplicates it, you get a variant that might be harmless or it might be devastating. And so what we're looking at when we say whole genome, we're talking about a technology that actually decodes all those letters. But then whenever you hear that term, you often have to think, okay, what are we then zeroing in on and interpreting? And so whole genome sequencing, you then have a choice. Do I look at one gene? Do I look at 100 genes? Do I look at 5,000 or 6,000 genes? So when I say whole genome sequencing, I'm using it as shorthand for sequencing all those letters and taking a broad look at interpreting 5,000 or 6,000 genes. When you do that, it's surprising how much you find.
There's challenges that continually come up that we had to overcome, and we didn't necessarily have the technology at the time to overcome those challenges. We needed more data, and that can be a very long tail. But when you talk about polygenic risk scores for, as you mentioned, Alzheimer's disease or diabetes, coronary artery disease, what are the challenges? How far are we away from having those types of products that people can access?
Yeah. The biggest challenge is that in the minds of the general public, genetics is still highly deterministic, meaning a large part of the public thinks that if you have a mutation, you're going to get the disease. They haven't quite switched to understanding that it is a probabilistic marker. And this is probably because of the earliest genetic test that was available and that captured the imagination of the public was Huntington disease. Huntington disease is 100% penetrant, meaning if you have the mutation of a certain size, you're definitely going to get the disease. So that captured our imaginations and gave this frightening determinism to all of genetics. Most of genetics is not like that. Most of genetics is if you have a certain DNA change or a certain polygenic risk score at the tail end of the risk, you are at increased risk. You're not definitely going to get it. That's good news and bad news. It's bad news because it's it's probabilistic. It doesn't tell you with assurance. But it's good news because you don't have to be as frightened about it. It's like a risk factor that we look for in all the rest of medicine. We look for high blood pressure. We look for elevated cholesterol. We think about family history and take that into account. So these are all ways that we try to risk stratify human beings in the practice of medicine and then give them the attention that they need. So if we can normalize that for genetics, if we can de-exceptionalize genetics, that would be a good thing. As you know, there's been this term about genetic exceptionalism, which means why are we treating this so very differently than other types of medical information? I'll also add that uh, procedural crime shows haven't helped because on
Right.
television, since DNA is a biometric, like a fingerprint, you get over and over and over again this notion that the DNA is precise and the DNA tells you the answer. So when people have gotten that kind of messaging, it's often confusing because DNA in healthcare doesn't work quite the same way.
In episode 15, we had Dr. Ed Esplin give us a history of the growth of clinical genomics as a business. He was very much a forerunner. In his medical school training, he was a part of sequencing portions of the Human Genome Project, sequencing portion of the genome for what we know today. And he was also a medical officer for a successful company that built a business of clinical genetics. And he talks to us around what are the differences between the 23andMe that are direct to consumer. Yes, 23andMe is still a company. You can still get that. I know you may heard bankruptcy and things like that, but the company still exists. So he talks to us around the difference between these retail genetic tests that are used for ancestry and other great information and clinical genetic testing that your doctors will use to make treatment decisions with and for you. Very valuable conversation.
Direct to consumer tests like 23andMe or once upon a time 23andMe, and there's certainly others that will tell you things about your genetic predisposition or genetic, markers that you have that is marketed directly to consumer. You don't need a doctor to order that, and it will provide you information on your genetics. What's the difference between the way that you guys and your science team at Invitae set out to create and market those products versus a 23andMe that went directly to consumer?
So I'll start just by highlighting the difference between what 23andMe's genetic assessment was and what we were studying and what we were developing the evidence for in the form of clinical germline genetic testing. I'm going to refer to germline genetic testing. This is something that some folks are clear on and some folks are not, but that's the assessment so germline testing refers to testing a patient's DNA, oftentimes from a blood sample, and testing their DNA that they have inherited from their parents and could pass down to their children. So that's what I'm referring to in terms of genetic testing, just for clarification.
Thank you for the clarity.
Yeah, no, of course. And what 23andMe had done, as I understand it, their primary offering to consumers was a form of they called it a genetic array, and basically what it was is they designed a test that would look for individual letters in a person's DNA code, hundreds of thousands of letters in a patient's DNA code, and they would do their screen for folks using that level of analysis. It's a very superficial analysis relative to the 3 billion base pairs, 3 billion letters of DNA that each individual has. And it was never intended to be used for clinical purposes. And the distinction with what I have worked on and I have done a lot of research in with Invitae and with LabCorp now is clinical germline genetic testing, in which we utilize an assay that has been refined over years, again, derived from some of the technologies that were developed during the course of the Human Genome Project, but leveraging, more importantly, the next generation sequencing technologies that are really changing the space for the better, to do full gene sequencing of every gene that we choose to analyze, or that a physician asks to have their patients be analyzed for, so that we can definitively determine if a patient has a mutation in a gene that causes disease, or if, say, for example, for BRCA1, if a patient is free of any mutations in that particular gene, so that they can know that they are not at increased risk as a result of mutations in BRCA1. And I'll note that some of the greatest impact of genetic testing, of clinical genetic testing, as you've alluded to already, is in patients diagnosed with cancer, because germline genetic testing in these patients is important, both from the standpoint of identifying the cause for their cancer, but also there are a number of FDA-approved targeted therapies, such as PARP inhibitors, that are specifically indicated for people who have a specific positive genetic test result and are affected with breast cancer, ovarian cancer, pancreatic, prostate cancer, and others. Also important to keep in mind is that this is important for improving the healthcare of individuals with family members who have cancer, because without knowing that genetic cause, family members of a patient who have cancer may need to undergo preventive surveillance. But once that genetic cause is identified in the person who has cancer, then the family members can receive testing to determine whether they are at increased risk or not. And then those who carry the genetic risk can take advantage of, as you referred to previously, the preventive screening, sometimes risk-reducing interventions that mitigate that risk. And those that don't carry that increased genetic risk can avail themselves of standard screening protocols to mitigate their population level risk. And I'll also note that this isn't restricted to cancer, of course, right? Genetic testing has also dramatically accelerated the speed of diagnosis for patients with rare diseases, and we're seeing an ever-growing number of targeted therapies either becoming available, for example, for patients with epilepsy, or in development and active clinical trials taking place, where, again, for example, there are treatment regimens already in place for example, patients with epilepsy that require a confirmed genetic diagnosis in order to apply that therapy. One example is pyridoxine-dependent epilepsy, where patients have epilepsy and they don't respond to traditional anti-epileptics, but they are effectively treated with high-dose vitamin B6, which you won't know unless you have done that genetic testing.
Just to put a bow on the commercial direct to consumer, because there's a lot of patients who might be watching this who have said, or it's been suggested, you should get genetic testing, and they Googled it and they got a 23andMe. There's others who have maybe taken their 23andMe into the doctor, and the doctor says, I can't use that, it's not FDA approved, or whatever. We can't make decisions on that. And their perception about the value of genetic testing was just kind of poo-pooed away. For those who may have, and there's millions of people who do have results from a 23andMe or a commercial direct to consumer versus, as you mentioned, a germline genetic testing done with NGS that has, volumes of evidence behind it, published peer-reviewed evidence. As a clinical geneticist, what do you say to those people about those who have a 23andMe and believe that they've got a similar product? What do you recommend or even suggest that they do there?
They need to get clinical genetic testing. And I'll do my best to paraphrase the FDA on this. They said as much as that with respect to 23andMe specifically, that the results of those tests are not to be used for any clinical purposes, and that if anybody received a positive or a negative result from a 23andMe test or similar tests like you described, they should have both positive and negative results confirmed by clinical germline genetic testing performed by a CLIA certified, ideally a CAP accredited clinical genetic diagnostics laboratory before anything should be done with those results.
Thank you for that clarity. One thing we really need is more buy-in from primary care physicians, whether that is your family doctor, internist, or your OBGYN, which to some women is their primary care doctor, because genetic insights can increase our ability to prevent disease. Our system is not currently designed to prevent disease. Yes, we can do all we can in terms of our own decisions for exercise, diet, and other health concerns. But our current system set up, as I learned from these experts, is very good at sick care. They're very good when we have a bad problem. But what we're not good at is recognizing potential problems well in advance and then intervening in some way to reduce or eliminate that risk, knowing that the problem exists. In a word, we practice sick care. And I talked to two experts around turning sick care into healthcare. We call it healthcare today, but it's kind of a misnomer because, we only go when we're sick. So Dr. Robert Greene, again from Harvard Medical School in episode 14, said during an interview, and I posted this. This is a comment that was made on my YouTube channel, but he was kind of Captain Obvious there. But what he said was the best way to live a long life is to not die young. Okay, somebody made a comment like, "Oh, wow, you're really smart there." But hold on, he is really smart because you'll hear from Dr. Greene about how he sees genetics being able to improve our current system to achieve true health care, to know what your risks are and to take measures and make decisions with your care providers to avoid a diagnosis or an illness at all. And then I talked to Dr. Michael Snyder, who runs the Snyder Lab at Stanford University, where the technology, I got an Oura Ring on, I've got a smartwatch on. Some of you guys have continuous glucose monitors. Well, that technology came out of the Snyder Lab. And in episode 19, we reflected on the potential that a smartwatch, a simple smartwatch combined with genomics, can have to maybe become our primary care providers of the future to truly improve our healthcare.
You've mentioned before that our healthcare system is not necessarily, paraphrasing, is not necessarily healthcare. We're very good at sick care. But in what you just described with using these sensors, these wearable devices, we can, recognize those red flags before something really happens to our body. And that just gives us another data point of our biometrics because, we kind of know when we're feeling bad, but, we've trained to ignore those things and be productive. But I mean, that's another big data point in the case of COVID, because everybody remembers them pointing this, the temperature monitor at your forehead. And I live in Texas, it's 110 degrees outside. Of course I'm 100 degrees. so, I mean, when you think about that disruption in the healthcare system, how do you think that this can really impact how we are taking our biometrics into consideration and in categorizing what's normal for a person to treat them effectively?
Yeah, well, you've covered a lot of points here. I'll start with the first one. Yes, we do sick care these days and not healthcare. And I'll be more blunt. I think our healthcare system is broken. We really need to shift to keeping people healthy rather than always trying to patch them up when they get ill. And so I think these measurement devices are very, very powerful for that. You're right. They're not yet adopted by the healthcare system because the healthcare system is slow. It's very conservative. They feel do no harm, make sure everything's working, but actually doing nothing is harmful. So I think we need the right balance here where we can look at these devices, bring them in when it makes sense. So it is true there is burden on us to show these devices have value, and we think they do. Obviously, I'm quite confident they can tell you when you're ill. We can even pick up asymptomatic cases of COVID with a smartwatch. Again, 80% of the time, because we'll see their heart rate jump up. It's a very sensitive measure. So what we need to do is get physicians a little more embracing of these technologies. We've got to prove that they do work. We think they do. We think our studies we're publishing are showing that. And then we got to show they have value so people will appreciate them. Now, in the case of smartwatches, I'm quite confident they can tell you when you're getting ill, but they do set off other red, this red alert system I was talking about, actually other things trigger it. Turns out number one trigger is workplace stress.
Yeah.
So it's also a mental health detector. But this is where we need more data because I'm quite confident we can tell the difference between a respiratory viral illness and when you're mentally stressed. Just your breathing's going to be different. So with more data, I'm sure we'll distinguish that. But even still, I would argue just knowing when you get these red alerts, if you're just sitting around not doing much. Now, if you run a marathon, by the way, your heart rate will stay up for several days. That triggers red alerts. That one's easy to contextualize and kind of ignore, so to speak. But if you're just sitting around being your normal self and you get a red alert, you're either mentally or physically stressed. And you should look into that. If it's physically, you might get a COVID test, for example, and see, oh yes, I'm positive. Maybe I shouldn't go to that party tonight and stay home and not infect I should stay home and not infect everyone. So I think you can use this information and even take Paxlovid, of course, in that case. So that there you have options. And I think that's the power of detecting these things early. And as you know, when you catch disease late, it's very hard to cure and fix. Cancer is like the perfect example. Once it's metastasized, very, very hard to cure, meaning when your cancer is spread. But if you can catch it early, you can usually treat it and minimally manage it, but in many cases cure folks if you catch disease early. And I think that's the name of the game. We want to keep people healthy. We want to catch disease when it first appears so we can, fix it. And again, keep people healthy. That's the goal.
You said that our current healthcare system is effective once a person is sick with cancer, heart disease, other diseases. But you were talking about the potential of genetics and genomics to bring about true healthcare, which is to prevent disease or keep patients out of the hospital. So if there's a healthy person watching this and they were to consider whole genome sequencing, how could they use that information to manage or prevent disease risk?
Well, I think that genomics, the study of multiple genes and many different variations that you could be carrying, is one of the most powerful ways to keep yourself healthy and to live a long life. You know, there's so much buzz about longevity right now. Well, one of the best ways to live a long time is not to die early. And so, if you can anticipate some of the medical illnesses that you might be vulnerable to, and you can take steps to look for them early or treat them early if you find them, it can truly help you live a longer, healthier life. Now, genomics is one element of this. There's science happening at so many different levels of evidence. So, genomics, which is the study of these variants in your genome, can uncover about 15% of individuals who are carrying a single gene mutation that puts you at risk for a significant medical problem. But that's not all. Your genome can also be used to look for the recessive carrier traits that you're carrying when you get ready to have children. And so you and your partner can know if you happen to be carrying mutations in the same gene, let's say cystic fibrosis or Tay-Sachs or any of hundreds of different recessive conditions that could result in a devastated child. That's still not all. You can look at 27 or so genes that specifically manage the metabolism of certain families of medications. And that's the whole arena of pharmacogenomics. And about 80% of people have an atypical response to at least one family of drugs that you might see through the years in your life. And that's still not all. There's something called polygenic risk scores, which is relatively new, in which you add up thousands of small effect size DNA changes and you build a bell curve and you place each human being somewhere on that bell curve. And each of us may be at risk, we may be on the tail end of risk for a common condition like heart disease, type 2 diabetes, prostate cancer, breast cancer, and several other conditions. And again, it's not a crystal ball, but if you know that you're at increased risk, you can take additional steps to monitor and catch things early. So these, just in the genome alone, these are 4 different ways you can look for and anticipate medical problems. And honestly, we're way past the time when we should be using this in day-to-day medicine. The value is unequivocal. It's potentially life-saving. We can debate about how many, if we were going to do 1 million people, we can debate about whether we should look at 3 genes or 20 genes or 81 genes or 5,000 genes. We can have a debate about that. But the fact that we're not using this routinely to anticipate, predict, and prevent illness, it's unfortunate today.
No matter what you do, no matter where you are in the world, no matter what device you're on, we cannot escape AI being promoted in different ways in our face. And I heard this recently is that 99% of all of us know absolutely nothing about AI. And so when it comes to healthcare, I did learn from these experts that healthcare is the fastest industry adopting AI. So where do we start? Well, a good place to start is with Andy Moy, the senior vice president at Tempest AI, and he talks to us about, the basics of AI, so we can help start to understand like what it is, what it does, and how it's being used in many different cases. And then we'll hear again from Chadi Naban, who talks about how this can help us scale clinical trials and get new drugs faster. What the heck is AI? Okay.
Yeah. Look, I mean, it's been, I think prior to ChatGPT, people wouldn't have a clue, and certainly wouldn't be impacting their daily life now like it is everybody's daily life. And the easiest way to think about AI, and it's certainly been around a long time, and it's, machine learning. People talk about these are all kinds of terms that get thrown around about foundation models and generative AI and AGI and things like this. But at the heart of AI is simply very, very complex pattern matching done by a computer. That's it, right? So you're able to train a computer system to learn something and then make a prediction about something. It's kind of like you teach your kid, the ABCs, and then you give them a test. Like, is this an apple? What letter does apple start with?
Yeah.
And so if they get that right, they're learning, and you can rely on them to sort of get that right every time. AI is no different, particularly in healthcare AI, which we kind of call deterministic AI, though a lot of the large language models and stuff have really started to shape some things, and generative AI has really started to shape some things. But it's really what it is. We think about, can a computer match a pattern, particularly a diagnostic pattern or an outcomes pattern, in order to help a doctor and help a patient get the best therapy possible, right? And that's really all it is. We can dive real deep in all the machine learning stuff and the engineering and the coding and all that stuff, but at the end of the day, really complex pattern matching is all it does. It's what Amazon does when you go and you search for shoes. Suddenly you're getting fed ads for Nikes. It's the same sort of thing. We've matched a pattern. You like shoes.
Yeah.
Really not more complicated than that.
Well, I appreciate you breaking it down like at a
Yeah.
at a very fundamental level. Um, but when you're creating products
Yeah.
for healthcare, right?
Yep. Yep.
And you just mentioned with like machine learning, you have to have a base set of information that you're training that machine
Right.
learning. So like, how can we be confident? And I guess what are the requirements
Yeah.
if you're creating this type of product
Yeah.
for a healthcare application? Like what kind of
Yeah.
training set do you actually need and how can people trust it?
So to stick with the very simple analogy, if I train my 3 or 4 year old on Russian alphabet, and then try to get them to tell me what letter Apple starts with, you're not going to get the A that you're expecting to come out, right? That's because that's the data set it was, he or she was trained on, right? And so the machine is no different, right? It learns from the data sets that we provide it. And if we think, very, very simple, um, application here of cancer detection, right? Maybe even something on a radiology image. So if you go and you get an X-ray, you get a CT scan for your lungs, can something predict, or mammogram, maybe to use that analogy. So woman goes to get a mammogram, and what happens is those images are looked at by a doctor. The doctor's been trained to know the difference between, a slightly opaque, dot in the screen from a slightly less opaque, what is cancer and what is not. You take all of those mammograms, and if you take millions of those mammogram images and you show it to a computer, and you tell the computer, hey, these ones were cancer and these ones weren't cancer, over time that AI is really going to understand the difference. It's going to know, well, this very, very subtle difference in opacity for what I'm seeing on the image, that equals breast cancer or something to be concerned with. These things maybe not, right? Those kind of things. And so the data is critical in clinical healthcare AI. You really have to ensure it's not just what you're training it on, but it's also what we call the ground truth. So what that means is like the same sort of concept here in the mammogram. If the ground truth, if it says, hey, I think this is cancer, you have to know that it was actually cancer, down range. So you have to train that algorithm to be right, to learn. Right? If it's learning the wrong things, it's gonna predict the wrong things. So the ground truth of what the data is, and then the actual data itself, really drives what we call the sensitivity and specificity of these tests, meaning how accurate are they, and how often do they give you either false positives or false negatives. That's all dependent on the data they're trained on.
Artificial intelligence, or AI, is something that we hear about every single day. Even, by the way, if you try not to hear about it, you're going to hear about it. Like if you switch the TV and the radio and everything,
Right.
somebody's going to tell you about AI.
Yeah.
So it's going nowhere. It is here to stay. What AI is basically a way of trying to make the machines that we utilize smarter to help leverage what we're trying to accomplish. One of the things that we do to transform cancer care is clinical trials. Clinical trials, these are studies that are being done for innovative treatments before they become approved by the FDA and they come to market. Pretty much almost any drug that we have used in cancer at some point was a drug in a clinical trial. So we believe that by being able to accelerate the way we conduct clinical trials, we can make things much faster and more efficient. Why is this important? Because it takes sometimes about 20 years from a drug to make it to market and for people to be able to prescribe it from the time we just think about it as a drug that could have an impact on cancer care. So if these 20 years become 15, are we going to save lives or not, especially if the drug is innovative? The answer is yes. I have to tell you, and stories, timing is everything.
Mhm.
This is for your audience and listeners. Every single time that I hear about a drug that is approved by the FDA, number one, I celebrate the success. I celebrate the fact that this actually is wonderful news and it's going to help patients. But then I pause and I reflect on the number of patients that I have lost
Mhm.
because they did not have access to this drug because it was approved now. If this drug was approved 3 years ago,
Yeah.
maybe some of my patients, families, relatives could have been alive if they qualified for this drug. So shortening that time is key because it's not going to have an impact on life and it's going to save lives. The way we do that is with artificial intelligence.
Pharmacogenomics, or PGX testing, is something that I learned a great deal about in these past 20 episodes. The ability to optimize our medications and save patients from excessive toxicity that poisons the body and unnecessary cost. If this isn't precision medicine, I just don't know what it is. Knowing that our genetic makeups are better with processing and will more drug, some drug will be more efficacious because of our DNA versus drugs that we don't have a high chance of responding well to, or we don't metabolize very well, and they can cause some serious problems for our health. I believe this is something that we all need to be aware of. And I spoke to patient advocate Karen Merritt in episode 8. She's patient advocate for Advocates for Universal DPYD testing prior to fluorouracil based chemotherapy, and that is 5FU. 5FU is used to treat almost every solid tumor out there. Thankfully, through her advocacy work on Capitol Hill and others, we now have NCCN guidelines for testing DPD therapy. I encourage you to go because we do deep dives into that in episode 8 and in episode 7 with Christine Ashcraft, who shares more information about how PGX testing can cap the cost of care. So, first, we're going to hear from Karen Merritt, who talks to us about what is pharmacogenetics, and then talk to us about the experience that she had with her mother and why she's so passionate that you know this information.
Pharmacogenomics is how your individual body responds to medications, so drug gene interactions. For DPYD, the gene, if you have certain mutations, your body doesn't make enough of the DPD enzyme. And this enzyme is critical for metabolizing, breaking down in your body the excess chemo from fluoropyrimidine chemotherapy, which is great chemotherapies for most people, but not
Yeah.
for people with those mutations.
What was the event that inspired you to become a patient advocate?
It was the loss of my mom in 2014. She started treatment on June 9th and she died on July 2nd. So, not even a month from her first infusion. And it is a horrific way to die. What we learned is she was DPD deficient and she should have been tested before starting that treatment. My mom's death certificate doesn't list toxicity of 5-FU chemotherapy because of DPD deficiency. It lists cardiac arrest because that was the final organ that went out. So her death was not reported as an adverse drug event, which would help the FDA, right, to know how many people are actually having these fatal toxicities.
Wow.
So now I advocate with others, and we founded the nonprofit so that we can raise awareness. And our goal is to get the standard of care in the United States to change and align with our European counterparts. We don't need more data, right? Like what the NCCN is worried about is the efficacy if they reduce the dose. And what we say is, well, first of all, there's no data to support that you're going to have reduced efficacy, because if you can only metabolize 50% of something, you shouldn't be given 100%. That, I'm not a scientist, and to me that seems very, very easy to understand. So if you're so worried about efficacy, but you're going to severely hurt or maybe even kill the patient, well, there's no efficacy in that. From the insurance standpoint, as you made, that they have a fiduciary duty also to protect their patients, is, my mom in 2014, let's say worst case, that DPYD test was $1,000. She spent 2 weeks in ICU, around the clock care. And what we didn't know is we were basically waiting for her to die. What we thought we were doing is waiting for her white blood cell count to recover and she would be able to, heal and get better. But the 5-FU obliterated all of her white blood cells. So she was not going to recover. It was basically watching a patient die. But that hospital bill with round the clock, she had 4 or 5 specialists seeing her every day, taking care of her, all the medication, the morphine that they were giving her to, stem off the pain. That was $500,000, all paid for Medicare. A newly diagnosed cancer patient, and you go to your oncologist, ask for a DPYD test, and don't take pushback, right? Like I think you mentioned earlier, like, this is our care, this is me. Yeah, this might be rare, but I want this test, and if they're told it's not standard of care, well, I want this test. Be firm in your commitment, and I would ask your oncologist, how can I contact you if I'm not feeling well? Like if I'm having moderate to severe side effects. And the Colorectal Cancer Alliances has a list of side effects for 5-FU and capecitabine that people can watch out for. And I think also the other thing I would say is, maybe not an ask, but a tip, is when you are going in to speak with your clinician, and because you're a cancer patient, is take other people with you so that they can help you write notes, because there is so much information. Sometimes we talk to people and they're like, I don't know, I learned so much, I don't know if they mentioned that test.
Yeah. There was a wonderful study that came out of Europe called the Prepare Trial. It was published in Lancet about 1.5 years ago, I think now. And this looked at panel testing in several European countries in all sorts of different care settings: cancer care, mental health care, primary care, in pharmacies. And the trigger was just, hey, we're about to give this patient a drug, and there are a lot of them that could be impacted by pharmacogenetic guidance. And so we would recommend a drug or a dose change if they had a certain liver highway variation, so to speak. And in just 12 weeks, they saw a 30% reduction in clinically significant adverse drug events. And that was across all of these different settings. Importantly, in cancer care, and I imagine a lot of your listeners may be battling cancer or caring for somebody that's battling cancer. They didn't count it as a significant adverse event unless it was stage 4 or stage 5. Stage 4 is severe or life threatening, can hospitalize you, and stage 5 is death. They still saw a greater than 30% reduction in clinically significant adverse drug events in just 12 weeks. I've also personally co authored studies that have shown dramatic reductions in emergency room visits, hospitalizations, saving $1,100 to over $4,000 per patient, depending on how acute the care setting was, in well under a year.
You hear me say over and over again that we want you to have confidence. We want you to have confidence. When you're dealing with a doctor who doesn't know this information, or they give you pushback because they may not be as comfortable with the information, or they may be comfortable and they just don't feel it's for you, but you feel it's for you. Our mission is to instill confidence in people to talk with their doctors, make shared decisions based on what you want, the desired outcomes that you want for your health. And using the power of social media, as I'm doing today, I've got a TikTok channel, Genetics for Healthcare, but I talked to Dr. Alan Wu. He has a lab. He has a TikTok channel called Lab Tales, who's been very successful using TikTok to educate the lay public about laboratory medicine and the importance of laboratory medicine. The lab is involved in every aspect of healthcare, and this is where gene sequencing takes place. This is where the biomedical specimens that are collected go so they can go to a lab who can do gene sequencing to find these genetic and genomic insights. So genes are sequenced. That's where the magic happens. And Alan Wu talks about the power of social media in raising patient awareness of genetics.
Well, I have embarked on a mission to educate um, the lay public on what the laboratory does. And that is a very difficult task because it's not like you can just write a paper in the New England Journal and everybody will see it. The lay public doesn't read medical literature. It takes a long time to get a good article published, and they don't generally publish stories about people. And so it is, there's no traditional platform for dissemination of medical and or laboratory information to the general public up until now. And so I would say the revolution of social media, and there are now a dozen different websites, you've listed some of them, is the way that information can be disseminated. Now, it doesn't come without a cost. The cost is that you don't always know if the information is true or not, that um, the data and the science is not vetted in the same way as a peer review article. So that is the downside of social media. But the upside is that you have instant distribution. It reaches thousands, tens of thousands, even millions of viewers very quickly. And like any media report, the content is subject to validation, that you can't just necessarily accept what is being said. You have to understand and then determine if the information is viable. But at least you have initiated a conversation.
I believe that social media obviously is where everybody is. You know, love it or hate it. There's some virtues to it, and that's to be able to deliver this type of information so just people are aware and hopefully encourage them to do their own research into these things.
Yeah, that is part of my platform. I believe that our population should be more involved in the medical decisions that are being made on themselves and on their loved ones. Now, that wasn't the case in my generation. My generation, people didn't have the internet when I was your age, and we didn't accept um, anything but what a doctor says is best for you. I don't think that that's good enough anymore. I think that patients should go to their provider, get laboratory data through portals, investigate the results of the tests that have been ordered, and have a dialogue between yourself and your provider as to why a particular course of treatment or a set of laboratory tests was selected. And then you become a participant in your own care. And why wouldn't you want to do that? There are plenty of credible medical websites that give you this kind of information, such as WebMD or the Mayo Medical, or there's a site called uh, tests, laboratory tests. And then you can be a more compliant patient because you have a reason for doing the things that your doctor says. Or if it turns out that the doctor isn't quite up to speed with everything, have that conversation and challenge that doctor. We shouldn't be so passive.
In episode 17, I spoke to filmmaker Landi Maduro, and we talked about having the confidence to navigate a doctor who is resistant to do what you want to do. Maybe you want these genetic insights, but that doctor doesn't feel you need them. And in this case, she advocated for her brother who has an uncle and a father with history of cancer. And even though he was 2 years before the recommended age for screening, he asked for screening and his doctor had pushback, and Landi helped him advocate. Take a listen to this powerful story.
We somehow forget that they're human, that they practice medicine, right? They have a medical practice, meaning they have come to surmise that a specific treatment works for this diagnosis based on the information they've had through doing it other times and through research from other scientists and things of that nature. And so we give them all this power and forget that the power that we have ourselves to advocate for our health. And so a huge part of what we've been doing, well, what we did with the film, and even now, why I'm a filmmaker, but I continue to go out and talk and advocate, and I'm on all these boards and coalitions because I want people to start advocating for their health. I'll tell you, just from a personal note, my father would not still be here if I had not basically, I don't want to say forced him to advocate for his health, but he had a daughter who was not taking no for an answer, or not taking, accept your diagnosis and live the rest of your life the best of your ability. That was not a good answer to me. I was like, there has to be more that we can do. And I wasn't happy with what I was being told. So I told my dad, we need to do more research, or we need to find other doctors. You have the right to a second opinion. A good doctor will tell you, get a second opinion, right? A good doctor will tell you, this is what we see right now, but if you have any further questions, let's talk it out. Or if you ask for a study or a test because you feel like the results you're getting are inconclusive, they're willing to do that. And if you're not getting that support, then yes, that's not the right doctor for you. Doesn't mean they're not a good doctor. They're not the right doctor for you.
Yes.
And I think sometimes we're so quick to think, the stereotype is, especially now post-COVID, doctors want you in and out. They just want your money. And then they want you, but some of that is the pressure that the doctors themselves receive because they're not being paid very much. And, there's so much, that's a whole nother, story in itself.
Yes.
But I want us to get out of this mindset that the doctor tells us something and we just go with it. We have to start to advocate for ourselves, to ask questions, to do our own research. If you're not someone who likes taking a ton of medication, then ask about other holistic things. My father found that they were trying to do chemotherapy on him. It didn't work for him. Chemotherapy, all it did was make him sick, wasn't affecting his tumors. Immunotherapy saved his life. But that took us leaving those doom and gloom doctors and going somewhere else.
One of the hallmarks of this podcast and what Genetics for Healthcare is becoming well known for are the practical tips that our guests give to our listeners to help become more effective advocates for themselves. in this and across all of our podcasts, we really give you a lot of the data, the language, the terminology, and the science to understand why this information is relevant for you and to have these conversations with your care providers and your family members to ensure you're maximizing your healthcare, maximizing this information for better insights into what can be done to make you well and to keep you well. And so, one of the comments that I hear is that doctors are really busy, and when they come in the room, they're there for 15 minutes. Sometimes, they may not even look at you because they're typing on their computer. The really good doctors make sure that there's a connection there, but there's no secret that they're pressed for time. And of all the things that they have to cover with you in a visit, genetics might require more time, or they may refer you out to someone else who can have that conversation. But in any case, it's important to put that out there, because what I've learned is, the doctors want to do the best things they can for their patient. And then if they don't have the time, the best doctors will say, okay, let me get back to you on this with answers. They may not have time then to answer all your questions, but they will. Some that may not will just dismiss your concerns or dismiss your wants and desires. And we don't want to do that. So I want to leave you with these two practical tips, recommendations from treating clinicians around why they welcome patients who ask a lot of questions. And this is important for someone out there, I know, because having these conversations with your doctors, having these conversations with your family members can be the difference between life and death. They can be the difference between effective therapy and ineffective therapy. So take a listen to Chadi Naban and also Ed Esplin talk about them being in a position of a treating clinician and having patients who come in with lots of questions, and put yourself in this situation about what you would do and how you can be more effective with taking this information from Genetics for Healthcare podcast and taking this to your care providers to ensure that they are considering genetic and genomic insights whenever they're making a treatment decision or care decision for you.
Practical tips. Number one is open a line of communication with your healthcare team. And please trust me on this. No question is stupid. It is so important to know that. It's just okay to ask questions. And I strongly believe if you're in the exam room, if you're talking to your healthcare team and you feel that your questions are not being answered, you feel you're being dismissed, you feel that people are making you feel these questions are not welcome and they're stupid, please go see somebody else. And the reason I say that, by the way, is because the journey of cancer is not going to be always smooth. You're going to have some tough time, you're going to have some great times, and you're going to hopefully emerge winner on the other side. But to get that, you're going to have some obstacles. And if you're not even getting your questions to start with, how are you going to get your questions answered later on when you have some issues? That's really important. So, open line of communication, understand no question is stupid. Feel free to ask questions. And the three questions I would say you should ask is number one, why did I get this cancer? Because asking the why is important. Now, the question could be we don't know, unfortunately, and frankly, probably that's going to be the most common answer. But there will be some situations where this is not the common answer, such as, well, it's an inherited situation from parents or gene in the family, or let me sequence your tumor and check the molecular analysis of this disease and try to understand if there's a particular mutation that drove the development of this cancer or things of that nature. So asking the why is fair. It's probably the most common question you get asked as an oncologist. And the first chapter in my book is what is cancer and what causes it. That is usually a lot. That's the common question. Number two, I think it's an important question to ask if nobody has checked your the genomics of your cancer, ask the question, is it okay to sequence my tumor? Can we send my tumor for genomic analysis? Do we know if I have a mutation or not? Basically, you're just asking if it's, you want to know the particular dynamics of the particular of the cancer that you have, and it's okay question to ask. And then the third question, from a practical perspective, are there any targeted therapies that we can use for my cancer? Any pills or things that can target the particular cancer versus the traditional chemotherapy that we normally use, where it doesn't really target a particular area in the tumor, it just targets everything. So these are the three practical questions to ask, and I do think they're important. And I think it tells you it hopefully leads to better answer and more open conversations. But ultimately, you need to feel empowered to ask these questions. I think patients inherently, they're overwhelmed, but they're also afraid of bothering you as a doctor. Well, that's your job. Otherwise, you shouldn't be in the profession of medicine. If you're going to be bothered by questions, you should find something else to do. That's one. And number two is they're afraid that the questions are silly or stupid. They don't want to sound like that. And there's no such a thing. There's no such a thing. I mean, how many times have we been consumers, me and you, in any type of establishment? It could be renting a car, buying a car, it could be whatever. You're buying a computer, you're going to Home Depot to buy something. You should see the type of questions I ask when I go to Home Depot. I mean, I think they literally know right now that I cannot even change a bulb in my house. But that's okay. I just don't know. And so that's only changing a bulb. This is your health. Everybody who's listening to this, and thank you for doing this show. This is the type of show everybody should listen to, should feel empowered to ask any questions. But these are the three ones I can think of.
As a treating physician, not an oncologist, but as an internist and as a clinical geneticist, I appreciate having patients bring to me things that they have read about, questions that they have, asking me if a particular test or if a particular approach is something that's appropriate to them, because I'll do my best to keep up with everything in the literature, but patients become experts with their own condition very quickly, I think, out of necessity, unfortunately. And it's an opportunity for both us as the genetics community to raise the awareness of and educate patients about the importance of germline genetic testing for patients with cancer across the board, for patients with rare diseases like epilepsy, like cardiomyopathy, like high cholesterol, autism, developmental delay and disability, and help them to prompt their physicians, to ask their physicians about genetic testing, especially in those cases where there are clear guidelines and clear evidence that support this. And the last thing I'll note about this is, you've already touched on it, right? Clearly, we need insurance policies to be updated to incorporate all of this evidence that has been accruing, the recommendations that changing on a regular basis and being updated on a regular basis in support of genetic testing. And I will call out what unfortunately is an unusual example, but kudos to this particular example. And this is an example of a very up-to-date and evidence-based medical policy for germline genetic testing in patients with colorectal cancer. This is the policy of United Healthcare. I think it's the largest commercial insurer in the United States. They put this policy into place back in 2020. And their policy supports, as medically necessary, germline genetic testing for every person who is diagnosed with colorectal cancer. And it doesn't stop there. It's medically necessary under their policy, and their policy supports testing of every individual who is diagnosed with any cancer that is associated with Lynch syndrome, which includes uterine cancer, which includes thyroid cancer, which includes small bowel, long list of cancer types. They put that policy into place, and that's the kind of thing that we need to see happening across other insurers. And also, we need physicians and patients to know, for example, if you're covered by United Healthcare, make sure you're getting testing if you have colon cancer or if you have uterine cancer, because it's a covered benefit. We did a study a little bit ago just looking retrospectively at patients who were covered by United Healthcare. And we found that in spite of the fact that that universal coverage policy is in place, less than 10% of all the patients covered by United Healthcare who had a diagnosis of colorectal cancer received germline genetic testing. And it was a covered benefit for them for which they qualified.
I got to tell you, this has been a tremendous joy, doing these last two episodes of the podcast, because they're look back episodes. And I got to tell you, much more difficult than doing, one podcast, because I had to go back and pour over 20 hours of podcast content, these great episodes with these great guests. And it's very, very hard to decide what to put in and what to leave out. And I just wanted to make this experience, this listen, as rich as possible for you, so you can get as much value as you can. So please listen, subscribe, share this content. We wanted to get it to as many people as we possibly can. I'm thankful for all of my listeners in 29 countries and touching 6 continents around the world. In our upcoming episodes, we're going to be tackling topics like cardiomyopathy, heart disease, pancreatic cancer. We're going to hear from NFL legends. We're going to tackle MRD testing, cancer prevention, and diabetes. So stay tuned in, follow us on social media, and please, reach out to me. I love your suggestions. I love your feedback, because I take them all to heart and try to incorporate your bright ideas, because if it's useful for you, I'll make sure that we get content that is useful for others as well. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you soon.